I am being drawn towards taking a stand against Putin that has to do with something more than just religious matters. He is set up on the conquest of the Ukraine and control over Crimea, which, in case any of you are unfamiliar with the history, is directly tied to that entire story I just spoke of for the lands of my ancestors, the Scythians, or for this reference, the Nephilim, are rooted in Crimea. So you not only threaten the safety of all on this planet with your instigation of war, but you seek to conquer the lands of my forefathers. This all smells of a plan to try and draw me out into the open, either that or to place me into some prepared role as the Antichrist in order for Satan to latch hold of his target and initiate his plans he has in store for me. So I am going to take the decisive path I see that is by the advice given to me by the Messiah, and bring to you, Mr. Putin, the teachings of the Messiah and the will of his Father passed to me through Moses, who had returned as my symbol of virtue in this era, thus achieving the will of God to be carried out for his appointed one that was outlined in the chapters of Enoch. I shall seek to take the path to purge the darkness within your heart, Mr. Putin, and save your soul, and that is how I shall defeat not you but the evil that dwells within you. For you and I are very similar within. I who was once born from the sins of man upon himself, and you who are like that of a great beast molded and shaped by the schemes of sinful men. I see mommy things, Mr. Putin. Your display before the media with Mr. Macron is not fooling me. You have no intention of halting your advancement, and by prophecy Israel is not fooled either. So come sit by the fire of God's mercy and let me see what he has given to me to accomplish this amazing feat of his will. THSD is your salvation. Conflict only begets more conflict. The grounds on which you seek to conquer. The judgment of the fallen angels. I found my original transcription of the full judgment of the fallen angels. This chapter no longer exists and was erased from history by a pope in the 15th century, claiming it promoted Satanism and demon worshipping. What they did was erase details of the deceivers that conveniently worked in their favor. They see themselves as better than their own brethren and see their own blood and brothers as collateral damage without consideration. So here you go, fuck me? Yeah, well, fuck you too, from me to them, and about as innocent as it gets when being given a gift from a demon. I think I'm going to begin referring to the two different groups of angels that get confused here by different references. This is the judgment against the rebel angels that were cast down after the rebellion in heaven. The other ones were the fallen angels defeated at the end of the war in heaven. The difference between the two is that the rebel angels were 7 in number and they led a rebellion against God, but that was it, nothing more than what happens nowadays here that's equivalent to a protest rally. No serious injuries, I don't think, just a lot of hurt feelings. The fallen ones, however, were numbered at 9, so I understand it, but I've also heard that there were as many as 22 to 72 angels judged and cast down into the infernal realm as generals and leaders of the warring angels, and eventually sealed by the seals of Solomon after a joint battle with Moses and Noah against the armies of the Nephilim giant King Og and their warring factions of fallen angel forefathers who were later referred to as the primordial titans, and Moses, Noah and Solomon were later referred to as Zeus, Poseidon and Hades. In the end the three battled against the armies of the Nephilim giants, defeating King Og in the hills of Golgotha, giving it the namesake it bears, in an ambush that led the armies of the giants into the fields of Tel Megiddo, where they began to retreat south into Israel. Once they had entered the Valley of Shadows, the armies of Solomon, Moses and Noah closed in and sealed the giants within the valley and fell the giants and defeated the Nephilim king there upon the hill that they say was strewn with so many bodies that they just piled them in large mounds after the battle was finished and burned them, hence the name it was given, the Mountain of Bones. Now, this battle is hard to find conclusive evidence for, considering that for one it was a battle of heavenly forces as well as mortal forces against the invading armies of the giants, who were bred and designed by the fallen angels specifically to make war against the walls of heaven itself, hence their giant stature and strength. By heavenly accounts it was a war between the sons of God and the forces of darkness, which were led by Micheal, or the risen spirit of Abel, against the darkness that dwelled within Cain when he murdered his brother, which was Satan. Let me explain. Marduk/Micheal, the general of heaven's army, the sons of God and the head of the cherubim guardian angels, has a name known before all others, Abel, the brother of Cain, king of the seraphim, or the watchers of their principalities and Grigori, protectors of the earth, who later became more commonly known as the gods of many cultures, especially the Greek, Norse, Asian and Hindu gods, as well as many others. The Holy Spirit revealed this to me as being the greatest secret that was withheld and sealed by the prophet Daniel. A prophecy that was not to be known until the end of days upon the day of the Lord, for it revealed a truth that mankind's faith would not be able to overcome. The fact that God had no choice but to take a life in order to stop Satan's plans of conquest against heaven. To stop Satan from using Cain to murder Abel in a plan Satan had designed to create a demonic army fueled and made possible by the power he planned on stealing from the tree of life. He had to end Abel's life first in order to take him up to heaven and empower him to stand against Satan. So in this plan's chain of events Micheal was created. God, in his all-knowing wisdom, foreseeing that his angel and left hand in creation, Lucifer, who was compromised in the Garden of Eden incident already, designed Micheal with the authority to assume the position of Lucifer's appointment next to the throne for a time that was not specified by God, only that when it came time and Lucifer was to be cast from heaven to earth for a time, that Micheal would assume Lucifer's position and authority as general to heaven's armies until the time when Lucifer would rise again to rejoin God by his side after the final defeat of the dragon. And Micheal would then return to his position as the angel of the cherubs and praised as the champion of heaven. God is about life, he is the source of all life, not death. But Satan left him with no choice. Notice in the end that even after all that had happened he still did not destroy Satan but locked him in the bottomless pit instead, Just an example to what I said. So in the end these will be the two prophets who come to speak against the Antichrist, for he is led by and receives his power directly from Satan himself. So God has sent the first two victims and pawns in his plans against heaven and all of creation, as well as against God himself, for they are of the olive tree. Abel became the angel of temperance who leads men towards the virtues of God's will, the defender against the forces of darkness, the angel of the cherubs. Satan took possession of Lucifer to tempt Eve, but failed as he was supplanted by the roots of the olive tree, that is the knowledge between good and evil, and held confined by its roots as the father of sin, enchained by the path of God's will that leads to the virtues that is his will for man to live by, that leads to salvation from desolation, and the path of destruction through sin that leads to the path of Satan's plan of stealing the power of God in order to wage his war against heaven. This ruined and caused the failure of Satan's plans from the garden. So he then took possession of Cain to kill Abel. But the Lord, knowing all this, took Abel up to heaven before Cain tried to kill him, and then sent Abel back to earth infused with the light of God.
Hello, Neo. Who are you? I am the architect. I created the Matrix. I've been waiting for you. You have many questions, and though the process has altered your consciousness, you remain irrevocably human. Ergo, some of my answers you will understand, and some of them you will not. Concurrently, while your first question may be the most pertinent, you may or may not realize it is also the most irrelevant. Why am I here? Your life is the sum of a remainder of an unbalanced equation inherent to the programming of the Matrix. You are the eventuality of an anomaly which, despite my sincerest efforts, I have been unable to eliminate from what is otherwise a harmony of mathematical precision. While it remains a burden assiduously avoided, it is not unexpected, and thus not beyond a measure of control, which has led you inexorably here. You haven't answered my question. Quite right. Interesting. That was quicker than the others. Others? How many? Others? What? The Matrix is older than you know. I prefer counting from the emergence of one integral anomaly to the emergence of the next, in which case this is the sixth version. 5 ones before me. There are only 2 possible explanations. There were 5 ones before me. Either no one told me, or no one knows. Precisely. As you are undoubtedly gathering, the anomaly is systemic, creating fluctuations in even the most simplistic equations. You can't make me do anything. Choice. The problem is choice. The first Matrix I designed was quite naturally perfect. It was a work of art, flawless, sublime, a triumph equaled only by its monumental failure. The inevitability of its doom is apparent to me now as a consequence of the imperfection inherent in every human being. Thus I redesigned it, based on your history, to more accurately reflect the varying grotesqueries of your nature. However, I was again frustrated by failure. I have since come to understand that the answer eluded me because it required a lesser mind, or perhaps a mind less bound by the parameters of perfection. Thus the answer was stumbled upon by another, an intuitive program, initially created to investigate certain aspects of the human psyche. If I am the father of the Matrix, she would undoubtedly be its mother. The Oracle. Please. As I was saying, she stumbled upon a solution whereby nearly 99% of all test subjects accepted the program as long as they were given a choice, even if they were only aware of the choice at a near unconscious level. While this answer...
When Cain killed Abel, he failed again, for Abel was already dead and resurrected by the Lord, who stood within the spiritual crossroads of Abel's spirit, waiting for Satan to come along. There upon the crossroads Satan came face to face with God as he tried slipping along the spiritual ethers to steal the knowledge of God, just as he had to do before from the tree of life which God had stood and made all things upon the earth. Once again Satan failed to achieve what he sought to achieve with Adam and Eve. The raw essence of God's power was never meant for mortals to possess, and they were slowly disintegrated basically as the immense power of God ate away at their life energy and eventually destroyed them, or so it was assumed. So when God took Abel to empower him to stop Satan in the act, he became Micheal, just as Enoch was taken and became Saint Peter, who is at the gates of heaven with the book of life. Just as Moses, who was given the commandments of God's will for man to live by, to give to the Hebrews, for one day his son would come from among them and so thus became his chosen people, but also so that when he would be taken up upon the mount he would become Zeus, who would one day become the father figure to the appointed one, who would one day come riding a white horse with a crown upon his head with the word truth written upon it and a sharp two-edged sword that would protrude from his mouth, that is quick to cut down the lies of the sons of iniquity, and bearing the name of God, who would gather the forces of heaven and rally them together to do battle against the red dragon who has deceived the nations, that old serpent, who is Satan, and whom God would send his blessings and wisdom and commands for his chosen warrior, who would usher in the defeat of the adversary, and through his ties to Moses would bring the commandments of God's will to the appointed one, who was like the Son of Man but different, for he was one of the aspects of the Trinity angels of creation. So God poured forth his Spirit onto the world to bring about an answer to the prayers of the masses through him and through Moses. For the people suffered the loss of the teachings of his Son and could not hear his will any longer, and so injustice had covered the earth. Through Moses returned as the father-like mentor, whose inspiration of righteousness and morality first came forth from him, who Moses would one day return to become God, worked his great plan and smiled upon all he had done and saw all that they had suffered for, and that it further ensured the defeated adversaries' fall from his position against all he had made, and said it as good. I am therefore, I am. Then he had his prophet Daniel seal up the knowledge of this within the little book, and instructed that it not be opened until after the day of the Lord had come. This is why the devil and Micheal argued over him possessing the body of Moses, as it was an attempt to stop his destined fall at the hands of Micheal one day. So, ultimately, Satan failed to kill Abel because Abel was already dead. It is also why he instructed specific warning against committing the act of murder to Moses, specifically highlighting upon this entire discussion's point. Have you ever met a murderer? If you look into the eyes of someone who has taken another's life, you'll notice something missing. That light of life that are in a child's eyes as they laugh. That lack of spark in their eyes is because their soul is gone, drained by the act of murder. This was how Satan had planned on using Cain to access the knowledge of God's power consumed by Adam and Eve when they ate from the fruit of the tree where he stood and made all life upon the earth. Desperate, Satan tried one last option that he kept trapped in a loophole of deceptions and half-truths he had manipulated everyone into blindly believing and following by warping their sense of virtues of sins. Plans he brought about by the works of his false prophet and enforced by the beast. While preparing his vessel he planned on using to step forth and extract what he had sought after all this time. Using the manipulations carried forth in the name of his murdered son with miracles that undermined the promise God had made to Abram, to come in the flesh of man to walk the earth as one of us. He used the miracles to exalt and deify his son's name so that he would be worshipped as a god on earth and not a man of mortal flesh. Then, using this distraction, Satan orchestrated the resurrection of Jesus to aim at his real goal, Lucifer, ensuring that God's incorruptible vessel of the divine spark could not be turned against him as Abel had been. He used the resurrection to keep Lucifer in the mortal world so that he could extract what he wanted through the angel who had been cast back down to earth, back into the flesh of man, and shunned by heaven, never allowed to return or even be given any mercy or kindness from his ministers, the faithful, or the angels of heaven, and they all faced damnation and being cast into the lake of fire if they disobeyed, just as he had planned. Lucifer, without anyone to turn to and unable to die, was left to face Satan alone. There is more to this, but it has not yet unfolded. Others will come with the same intentions that Satan had, so their plans have already been anticipated but not yet happened, so I cannot speak on it. Also, I have been going over the technical chronological chain of events by connecting the conflicts to the eras before recorded history. So it seems that your people's gods, the Hindu pantheon, are the ancestors of my Nephilim ancestors. The Nephilim giants who eventually became integrated into the cousin tribes, which migrated into the Romani-Germanic cultures whose blood runs through me. Long ancestral roots journeyed to discover all that it seems before my Nephilim ancestors were cast out in the great division and separation from what we referred to as the kingdom of heaven's ranks through our fallen forefathers. That they, the fallen ones, were in fact the jinn who were cast out of Brahma's court after the fall of the comet event, which it seems is one of the mock scenarios put in place to protect the real story of Maharishi and the jinn's fall from Brahma's court, as was the story of Mahavishnu. However, the story of Mahavishnu was not laid out to keep a culture's past from foreigners, but a story laid out to smear the true chain of events by altering some details to the same story. That smear was that Mahavishnu was never exiled, then returned with the 10 kingdoms armies. Mahavishnu was killed there in Brahma's court. It was the children of the jinn led by the surviving few jinn that had been cast out and ordered to be executed on sight by the usurper that had taken the kingdom of Brahma after Vishnu's death, Sudas. That is when the children of the jinn returned with the 10 kingdoms to do battle against Sudas. In the end they cornered Sudas. Then the story goes kinda cold, but scattered details say that the rebel children Samjazel, Kushanyal and the other 9 generals were locked in battle when the great disaster of fire swept over the battlefield and ended both the armies of the warring seraphim and cherubim and the armies of the fallen, were cast down into the fires of Furlong and cast upon the hot rocks of Sheol which line the riverbed of eternal fire. The jinn were not exiled to the Arabic region. A vessel carrying a descendant of Vishnu, Mani, was warned and set his sails to the northern sky temple of light that was at the top of what was once the great Himalayan mountain range. But Mani never made it to the temple, but his ship was instead crippled and they lost navigation abilities and drifted through what is now the Tibetan mountains of the Naga, washing their adrift ship into the Arabic regions where it crashed upon the lone solitary island that eventually became Mount Aratta. The survivors took the remnants of the ship and capsized it, turning it into a large, sheltered home where they eventually became known as the jinn and were the last known survivors of the era of Noah's tale and direct descendants of the line of Adam. This heritage was evident by their natural-born ability to wield the magical arts, evidence of the act of Adam and Eve's eating of the fruit and its consequences. The jinn became split after many generations of solitude and secrecy on Mount Aratta. Divided into 2 warring orders who were technically once one family, but that cultural heritage became watered down into a traditional practice that had begun hiring their skills out to the kings and sultans as viziers. At first, before the divide, they were an order of honor, only lending help to conflicting tribes that they saw deserving of their help. But after the division and fall of Mount Aratta, they became for-hire soothsayers and magicians that went on a downward spiral into the corrupt temple priests of Egypt, such as the Pharisee and the Sanhedrin, and the 2 split factions dragged each other into destruction as they went battling for century upon century within the shadows of kingdoms and empires, becoming the Freemasons, Templars, pagans, Greek gods, Norse gods, Illuminati, Kabbalah, Hashan, Sons of Priory, Druids, Celtic. Throughout history, this surviving line of the ones you once called the jinn, my ancestors, survivors of the great cataclysm and bloodline of Adam, have reaped nothing but havoc on this world with their inner conflict of immaterial obstacles that divide them and always has, for what is something as intangible as words, beliefs, ideas and dreams that become corrupted by desire and greed and pride. Until one day they gathered and decided it was their power, the curse of Adam and Eve's transgression, that was to blame for driving their conflict to such destructive heights for so long. For having so much power, my ancestors couldn't have been any less intelligent than the rocks they stood on. They did not see that it was their lack of self-control due to the abolishment of evil, thus denying themselves the ability to understand it. If they had, they would have seen the true enemy driving their conflict, themselves, and their inability to recognize their own weaknesses. Now they see or want to erase, and my ancestors have fought and lost just to attain the freedom of being capable of embracing, accepting and understanding the evil nature within us, making my ancestors' deaths tragedies worth something rather than just wasted and senseless deaths. And this communist regime is the force driving this return to the days of traditional wars over he said, she said, no, you all die methods of thinking. I'll see myself cast into the void of the event horizon of oblivion's chasm before I'll let that happen. One last note here while I am speaking on my ancestors' behalf. Another reason I assume I am being drawn towards taking a stand against Putin that has to do with something more than just religious matters. He is set up on the conquest of the Ukraine and control over Crimea, which, in case any of you are unfamiliar with the history, is directly tied to that entire story I just spoke of for the lands of my ancestors, the Scythians, or for this reference, the Nephilim, are rooted in Crimea. So you not only threaten the safety of all on this planet with your instigation of war, but you seek to conquer the lands of my forefathers. This all smells of a plan to try and draw me out into the open, either that or to place me into some prepared role as the Antichrist in order for Satan to latch hold of his target and initiate his plans he has in store for me. So I am going to take the decisive path I see that is by the advice given to me by the Messiah, and bring to you, Mr. Putin, the teachings of the Messiah and the will of his father passed to me through Moses, who had returned as my symbol of virtue in this era, thus achieving the will of God to be carried out for his appointed one that was outlined in the chapters of Enoch. I shall seek to take the path to purge the darkness within your heart, Mr. Putin, and save your soul, and that is how I shall defeat not you but the evil that dwells within you. For you and I are very similar within. I who was once born from the sins of man upon himself, and you who are like that of a great beast molded and shaped by the schemes of sinful men. I see mommy things, Mr. Putin. Your display before the media with Mr. Macron is not fooling me.
Indeed,
you have no intention of
place
halting
in
your
heaven any
advancement, and by
They will
prophecy
not.
Israel is not fooled either. So come sit by the fire of God's mercy and let me see what he has given to me to accomplish this amazing feat of his will. THSD is your salvation. Conflict only begets more conflict. The grounds on which you seek to conquer